problems started quietly. Fewer affordable houses on the market, tougher mortgage loan requirements from banks. Now, real estate, the engine that has powered Australia's economy for the last 30 years, is stalling. But this isn't just a story about real estate agents or bankers. It's about a dangerous gamble the Australian government made decades ago. They bet the entire nation's future on continually rising home prices. And for a while, they were right. Australia's residential property market is now worth $12.3 trillion, about 4 times its annual economic output. But recently, hidden risks have emerged. It is clear no one truly understood just how fragile the system really was. And now, the country is about to pay the price. To understand why the current situation is so dangerous, we have to look at how this housing growth engine was built. Let's break down the mechanics. The logic was simple. When home prices rise, household wealth expands automatically. And in Australia, average home values have increased approximately 560% over the last 25 years. That new equity allows regular people to borrow more money against their homes. This new borrowing drives massive construction activity across the country. It also fuels everyday retail spending. People feel richer, so they spend more money at shops and restaurants. Over time, housing stopped being just about shelter. It stopped being just another normal asset class. It became the absolute center of Australian economic expansion. The math was simple. As long as prices went up, the whole economy grew. This created a powerful feedback loop. Banks issued larger mortgages, which pushed property values higher. Those higher values allowed homeowners to extract equity to buy cars and investment properties. For decades, the government told its citizens not to worry. They created a system that heavily favored property investors. Policies like negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts turned housing into a tax shelter. The explicit reasoning was that this would encourage investment and increase the housing supply. But it actually did something else. It turned homes into financial products. It created a massive gap between the people who own property and the people who just worked for a living. By designing the perfect wealth machine for homeowners, Australia decoupled its national wealth from its actual industrial output. Money stopped flowing into new businesses. It stopped flowing into technology or new factories. Instead, it got funneled into static bricks and mortar. The entire banking sector shifted its focus. Today, over 60% of all bank lending in Australia goes toward residential property. They look at the risk and choose the safe bet of a physical house. This starves the very industries that actually create economic growth. This result was not an accident. It was a deliberate trade-off. The entire system was designed to protect asset prices at all costs. But this success created a paradox. The entire country became completely dependent on one single asset class. The government built an economy with zero margin for error. Think about the mechanics here. If you base your entire national growth on people taking on more debt to buy more expensive houses, you eventually hit a wall. You eventually run out of people who can afford to borrow. And right now, that is exactly what is happening. The structural bet that kept Australia wealthy for 30 years is finally breaking down. But why now? The entire Australian economic system was built on one very fragile assumption. The government and the banks assumed there would always be enough demand to keep home prices rising forever. They relied on relentless population growth. They relied on unprecedented access to cheap borrowing. And they relied on heavy investor participation. This strategy worked flawlessly in the right conditions. But it leaves the economy with zero margin for error if any of those pillars begin to weaken. And right now, that is exactly what is happening. The assumption stopped holding. The trigger was not a dramatic market crash. There was no sudden panic or fiery collapse. Instead, it was a silent collision with reality. The demand engine simply hit a brutal mathematical ceiling. The numbers became too large to sustain. To understand why, you have to look at the leverage trap. Australian households now carry some of the highest debt levels in the developed world. Right now, the ratio of household debt to disposable income sits at an astonishing 176%. Let that sink in. For every dollar a family earns after taxes, they owe nearly $2 in debt. The vast majority of that is tied up in mortgages. The debt burden is a massive anchor dragging down the financial system. With debt nearly double annual income, there is simply no borrowing capacity left. Families cannot take on larger loans. They cannot stretch their paychecks any further to meet higher asking prices. The engine that pushed prices up for 30 years relied on buyers taking on more and more leverage. But there is a hard limit to how much debt a normal worker can carry. That leverage trap is now snapping shut. To see how, you have to look at the regulators. Behind the scenes, they are already activating new plans. The Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA, looked at the math and saw a massive systemic threat. Starting in February 2026, they are forcing banks to cap high-risk loans. If you want a mortgage that is 6 times your income, you're going to hit a brick wall. Banks are now mandated to limit those massive debt-heavy loans to just 20% of their new lending. Think about that. The banking regulator is actively stepping in to stop the debt machine because they know the structural risk is too high. This is not a slight policy tweak. It is a hard break on the exact mechanism that drove property prices into the stratosphere. Without those massive 6 times income loans, the marginal buyer disappears. The person who would have bid up that suburban house by another $50,000 simply cannot get the money. And when the marginal buyer cannot borrow, the house is sold at a lower price. This brings us to the most confusing contradiction. Australia is experiencing a record population boom, yet the credit tap is being turned off. You have more people fighting for homes, but the actual money supply needed to buy those homes at current prices is shrinking. The hope was that incomes would eventually rise to match the debt, but they did not. Wages flatline. So now, you have a population completely maxed out on credit, facing a regulatory wall that prevents them from borrowing more. The ceiling has been reached, and that ceiling is going to crash down on the rest of the economy. Housing is not just an asset. It is also the foundation of the Australian labor market. When the credit engine stalls, the damage does not stay contained in the banking sector. It bleeds into the real economy. When buyers cannot borrow more money, developers hesitate. They look at the math and realize new projects do not make sense. Fewer homes break ground. Right now, dwelling completions are falling 27% short of government targets. The country only built about 174,000 homes recently, completely missing the federal goal of 240,000. Approvals for new detached homes have plummeted to their lowest levels in over a decade. That is not just a simple housing shortage. That is a massive loss of core economic activity. Fewer projects mean fewer tradespeople working on site. The plumbers, the builders, the electricians, they all see their workload shrink. This pushes the slowdown straight into the broader labor force. The construction drag acts like a giant weight on employment. When building stops, the paychecks stop. And the national housing shortage, currently estimated at up to 300,000 homes, just keeps getting worse. But the problem goes much deeper than construction-related jobs. We have to talk about the wealth effect. For decades, rising house prices made Australians feel rich. But that was an illusion. It was wealth on paper. The secret crutch of the entire economy was equity extraction. When your home goes up in value by $50,000 in a year, you feel safe spending more. You might take out a loan against the house to buy a new car, take a trip, or renovate a kitchen. The paper wealth supported everyday consumer spending. It kept the shops busy, it kept the restaurants full, it made the whole country feel prosperous. But what happens when that paper wealth stops growing? The wealth effect reverses. When home values stagnate or borrowing costs eat up all your spare cash, you stop spending. You cancel the kitchen renovation. You do not buy the new car. The retail sector takes a massive hit. The entire domestic economy, which relies heavily on consumers feeling wealthy, suddenly faces a harsh reality check. The illusion of momentum fades, revealing an economy that forgot how to grow without relying on a housing boom. When the wealth effect fades and price growth slows, a new problem emerges. The distribution of wealth freezes right where it is. For decades, rising home prices lifted everyone who owned property. But when that engine hits a mathematical ceiling, society splits in two. Older homeowners are sitting on massive untaxed gains. They locked in their wealth when prices were low and credit was easy. But younger households face a completely different reality. They are staring at an impossible barrier to entry. Look at Sydney right now. Per the latest Demographia International Housing Affordability Index, the median home price is more than 13 times the median income. Compare that to other major cities such as San Francisco at 10 times, Greater London at 9.1 times, and Toronto at 8.4 times. Let that sink in. Over 13 times what a normal worker in Sydney earns in a single year. When access to the primary wealth-building asset is closed off, social mobility dies. You cannot work your way into a market that requires $1 million loan when your wages barely cover basic rent. The door simply shuts tight. People give up. They stop trying to save because the goalpost moves faster than their paychecks. This creates a permanent class of renters who spend over a third of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. They are trapped outside the system while paying the mortgages of their investors who own the homes. This divide destroys the social contract. It turns a working class into a renting class. And the reality for the renting class is getting darker by the day. Right now, the national vacancy rate is sitting at an emergency low of 1.2%. In cities like Perth, it is virtually zero. Because there is nowhere to live, renters are being squeezed dry. The average renter is now spending over 33% of their pre-tax income just to keep a roof over their head. That is a record high. When you spend over a third of your gross income on rent, you cannot save for a deposit for a new home. You cannot invest in a business. You are simply treading water. Meanwhile, some property investors are tactically jumping back into the market. They are using the equity from their existing homes to buy up whatever scarce supply is left, completely outcompeting first-time buyers. The tax system actually rewards them for doing this. Policies like negative gearing mean that if an investor loses money on a rental property, they can use those losses to reduce their personal income tax. Think about that. The government is literally subsidizing investors to bid up house prices and lock out the working class. But the damage goes far beyond just the younger generation. It breaks the entire national economy. This is what happens when a country turns housing into its dominant engine. You look rich on paper, but your actual productive capacity is hollowed out. This creates a productivity flatline. To see the real cost, look at where the money goes. It does not go into building the future. Right now, Australia spends just 1.7% of its GDP on research and development. Compare that to the rest of the developed world. The OECD average is 2.7%. That gap is massive. When you look at business investment specifically, it gets even worse. Australian businesses spend less than 1% of GDP on research. The global average is double that. To just reach the middle of the pack, Australia would need to inject an extra $32.5 billion into innovation every single year. But that money is nowhere to be found. Why would an investor take a risk on a new business when they can get a guaranteed tax-advantaged return on a house? They do not. The incentive structure is broken. The money is not building new tech companies. It is not funding new factories. It is not creating high-paying jobs. Capital stops flowing into innovation, research, or small businesses, and instead gets buried in suburban dirt. Now, you will hear a different story from the optimist. They look at the headlines and argue that the housing machine has plenty of fuel left. They point to the massive wave of new arrivals. With net migration hitting 1.3 million people in just 3 years, they claim the sheer physical demand for shelter will keep prices climbing forever. They point to aggressive government interventions, like the expanded 5% deposit schemes, which are specifically designed to drag first-time buyers back into the market. And above all, they point to the 2025 interest rate cuts as the ultimate release valve. The logic is simple: cheaper money, government guarantees, and more people will keep the housing engine running. It is a comforting narrative. It suggests the system just needs a small adjustment to keep going. But here's the thing. Policy tweaks and population growth can delay the ceiling, but they cannot reset the brutal math. The structural trap is permanent. Right now, median house values across the country have reached an astonishing 8.9 times the average income. For a normal family trying to buy a home today, mortgage serviceability is swallowing up to 50% of their take-home pay. You cannot outregulate a math problem. When half of a household's income goes to just servicing the interest on a loan, the economic engine is completely out of fuel. Rate cuts do not create new wealth. They just lower the cost of existing debt. The long-term outlook for the country is no longer about managing rapid growth. It's about managing a slow, painful stagnation. The math is finally catching up with Australia. The debt ceiling has been reached. The building sector is stalling, and a massive portion of the population is being permanently priced out of the wealth machine. The structural risk is no longer hidden. Subscribe to see which other developed economies are quietly failing behind the scenes.